Hi, my name is Margaret Weidekamp. I'm a curator here at the National Air and Space Museum. I work in our Space History Division, and I'm going to be doing a special talk today. This will be just a short 10-minute lecture. We're going to be going upstairs into the Apollo to the Moon Gallery, and I'm going to be talking about Gene Kranz and Apollo 13 and the white vest that you probably have seen in historical newsreels, but also in the Ron Howard film Apollo 13. So if you want to hear about that, come on upstairs with me right now. This is, in fact, a relatively new acquisition for the museum. This is Gene Kranz's white vest, his suit vest that he wore when he was a flight controller, and specifically this is the one that he wore when he was the flight controller for NASA during Apollo 13. So what I want to do today is to talk to you a little bit about this is something that's new to the museum. We only acquired it in 2005. It's new to being out on the floor. I'm very excited to get to bring it to the public and get to show it to you because I think it's an important object that tells us a bit about space history, but also about the symbolism of human spaceflight and how important that has been in American culture. And it allows us to tell us both about the men and the events. So this is a white suit vest that belonged to Eugene Kranz, who was a flight controller. He was born in Toledo, Ohio. He began his career in the Air Force. He was trained as a pilot and flew in Korea, and when he came back from Korea, he went to work for McDonnell Aviation, who many of you know helped to build the Mercury capsules and the Gemini capsules. He spent only a little bit of time there before then going to work for NASA and becoming a part of the Space Task Group, and he was assigned to MC, which later became known as Mission Control. At that time, it was known as Mercury Control. They were working on the systems, the ground systems that would support the Mercury space flights. And so he was hired and he went to work for Chris Kraft, who was the very first of the flight controllers, who Chris Kraft actually joined NASA when it was still NACA, when it was still the National Advisory Committee on Aviation. Aviation or aeronautics? Aeronautics, thank you. And he actually originated the idea of Mercury Control. They needed controllers on the ground, that the spacecraft, most of the computers, most of the guidance system, most of the navigation was actually on the ground, and they needed a system to be able to figure out how to make decisions as flights happened. And so the system that they worked out and that these folks actually originated was the idea of simulating missions over and over and over and making decisions. And as they figured out the best decision for a given scenario, they would write that down, and they started to compile lists and books of mission rules. And that was really the Bible of what became Mission Control, is controllers who knew their particular systems, who watched those on monitors, and who then could make in an instant go, no-go decisions on any particular scenario based on the fact that they had tried to simulate and run the missions over and over and over before they actually flew. And so Gene Kranz joined that team. Kranz was known as a kind of characteristic flat top. He still wears a very military-style haircut, and at the time, I actually had the chance to talk to his wife, and she said, well, three-piece suits were very in fashion. And she liked to sew, and she had a sewing machine. She and her daughters all sewed. And so she would make vests for him. And this actually, the white vest that became his trademark, came out of the fact that by the time the Gemini program was coming around and you had flights that were going over 24 hours, what the Mission Control did then was divide the day into 8-hour shifts with about an hour of overlap for handing off from team to team. And they came up with 3 separate teams: red team, a blue team, red, white, and blue, a red team, a blue team, and a white team. And Chris Kraft, who was the senior mission controller, picked the color red and picked his team first. And John Hodge, who was the next junior flight controller, picked the color blue and picked his team next. And Gene Kranz, who was the youngest at only about 37, got the least popular color, white, and he got not the least popular of the mission controllers, of the flight controllers, but he got the junior members of the group. And so it was very important for him to create a sense of team, that this was not the leftover, this was not the youngest team, this was the white team, and that they were going to have a sense of team unity. And so his wife came up with the idea of him wearing a white suit vest that would actually then be a way of visibly being the leader of the white team and having that sense of team unity. So Gene Kranz was the flight controller at NASA. He worked on the Gemini missions. He worked on the odd-numbered Apollo missions. So he worked on 7. He worked on 9. He was the mission controller who was sitting at the desk when Apollo 11 actually landed on the moon. And so he was the one who led the team as they actually did that countdown and made the decision go for landing, and listened to the feedback from the astronauts as they actually landed on the moon for the very first time in 1969. But what he becomes most famous for is actually his leadership during Apollo 13. And many of you may have seen, may have read about this. You may have read Gene Kranz's own book, Failure is Not an Option, which is very much centers around the Apollo 13 mission, or you may have seen the Ron Howard major motion picture, Apollo 13, which does a relatively good job of depicting the events of the Apollo 13 mission. For those of you who have not seen this, the Apollo, or don't know the history, the Apollo 13 mission was intended to be a third landing on the moon. On the way to the moon, they had a problem that there was a wire that had become exposed. There was a sensor that should have been switched out from a 20-watt sensor to a 65-watt sensor. It hadn't been. They used these sensors and these heating elements in the bottom of the oxygen tanks to pressurize the tanks. As a result of the switch not having been made, that sensor, that heating element, had been overloaded previous to the mission, and then when it was sent on the mission, when they sent electrical current through it, the wire had its coating had dissolved as a result of the extreme heat on the previous test of it, and so it ignited the oxygen in the canister, and Gene Kranz was one of the ones who made the very quick decision to shut off and to close off the rest of the oxygen system in the rest of the spacecraft, and in doing so really saved the 3 astronauts. And the depiction in the film and of what happened in real life was of the Mission Control Center that really at that point went into what they called a tiger team, using a term from the military of the idea of really coming of a quick, on-the-ground, fast decisions, but trying to make the best decisions possible, and really working the problem of what do we need to do in order to send these 3 astronauts on a free return trajectory around the moon and then back home. And as we know, they succeeded. They solved problems with lithium hydroxide canisters that didn't fit from one vehicle to another. They solved problems about electrical carriage and how much electricity they could use, about turning the computers on and off, and they managed to bring those astronauts home. Now, when I managed to get this vest from Gene Kranz, he was, I don't want to say a little flummoxed. His initial reaction was no. I'm not giving one to the Smithsonian. He came to the museum to give the Glenn Lecture in 2005, and I approached him at the little cocktail reception before the lecture, and I asked him, when is the Smithsonian going to be able to get one of your famous vests, Mr. Kranz? And he said, I would loan one. We can do maybe an indefinite loan, but I'm not going to give one to the museum. And then he got up and he gave his really wonderful, very stirring lecture talking about his experiences with Apollo 11 and Apollo 13 and the lessons that he's learned. And he has gone on to be a motivational speaker based on his experiences, and it really is very gripping. And at the end of the lecture, in the question and answer period, one of our docents, I'm sad to say I don't remember who it was, got up and asked the question in front of the audience, when, Mr. Kranz, are we going to get one of your famous vests? And so he was standing up there with Jack Daly and the whole audience of hundreds of people. And he cornered me afterward and asked if I had planted that question. And I will say honestly now and for the podcast, I did not plant the question. I might have led the applause. So the result was that he agreed he would give one of his famous vests. And when he and his wife were talking to me about it and they were sending me pictures, his tradition was he wore a white vest during the missions. And then he wore a very splashy celebration vest, we could send that around, upon the return to celebrate the end of it. And so the vests that he had, that they really thought were really the most striking of the vests, have gold and silver embroidery. They have brocade, or they're bronze colored, or the one that's being passed around that came from his very last shift he wore during the landing of Apollo 17. It's red, white, and blue, sequin stripes. And so she was thinking, like, these are, the vests that people that are going to want to see in the Smithsonian. These are really the fancy celebratory vests. And of course, the one that we're all actually most interested in historically is the very plain white vest that he wore, that has become so famous as a symbol of his actions during Apollo 13. Because, of course, during Apollo 13, because they managed to get the astronauts back, but they did not succeed in landing on the moon and completing the mission, he never wore a celebratory vest for Apollo 13. And so the vest that we have here is one that was, this is a hand-sewn vest made by his wife. We've got a couple of the buttons have been a little bit nicked up, but other than that, it's in great shape. And he was also able to provide for us the pin that came with it that he wore on it for the mission. And so the characteristic picture of Gene Kranz, who was the author of what's called the Kranz Doctrine, the idea that after the Apollo 1 fire, Gene Kranz sat down and said, our standard is that we will be tough and competent. This is, every decision we make, that is going to be our standard. And when he set that kind of a tone, this is the vest that became the symbol of the white team, the symbol of what he was doing with Mission Control. And as is the tradition then with Mission Control, when Gene Kranz retired as a flight controller, they don't do a big celebration or a big thing. They just finish their shift and they move on. But they then also retire the color. So the flight controller who came on after him and who worked with his team took on the team, but they took on the color bronze. And so there have been a series of colors that have come afterwards. So white has been officially retired as a color at Mission Control. And so that is the story of this vest. I think it's important because it tells us about the history of Apollo 11 and Apollo 13. It begins in this gallery to allow us to tell some of the history of Mission Control, which is not a story that has been told in this space before. And it also gives that important connection, I think, to American popular culture. So many people who were not alive or not old enough to remember in the Apollo days what Gene Kranz did still know the story, know his name, know his face because of the depiction in the film Apollo 13. And that actually has had a tremendous impact. If you look at the public opinion studies that come out, the opinion of American human spaceflight is rather low before Apollo 13 comes out, and after Apollo 13, for a good 5, 7, 10 years afterward, American opinion of the importance of human spaceflight goes way up, and it's in many ways a reaction to that depiction, that fictionalized slightly depiction of this event. And so that is why I wanted to bring this story to you today.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Ask an Expert. A companion question and answer session for this lecture may also be available. For a schedule of upcoming Ask an Expert lectures at the museum, please visit www.nasm.si.edu.